September 1939, the German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
We have a very, very good guest today, another Hungarian like myself. We both speak fluent English, of course, Dr. Alex Sternberg. Dr. Sternberg wears many hats, even though you might not see any hat on him right now at all, except for a kippah. Dr. Sternberg is the Shomer Shabbat, lives in Long Island, comes from a city called Papa, P-A-P-A. It's in the western part of Hungary, not that far from the Austrian border. Before World War II, many Jews lived there, and most of them, about 90%, maybe even more, perished in Auschwitz. And Dr. Sternberg actually wrote a book, Recipes from Auschwitz. And I'm very glad that he is able to be here with us. And let's start the questioning, Dr. Sternberg. Tell us about Papa and how you got out of Papa.
I was born in 50, only 5 years after the end of the war. And Popov is a small, although a larger town in the area than many of the other villages. Papa had about 30,000 inhabitants. Before the war, there were about 3,000 Jews, about 10% of the population. And as you said, about 500 survived the war and about 2,500 perished. My father came back from the war and he met my mother, who was also a Holocaust and Auschwitz survivor, and they married and they settled in Papa. I remember as a little child, there was a strong amount of anti-Semitism that was constantly under the current. The only thing that saved the Jews from more open hostility actually was the communist government, because communism wanted to control who is going to be harassed as a Jew. They didn't want to leave that up to individual people. The communist state would harass if they wanted to harass, but it wasn't up to the individual. So basically, we had a nice life. I enjoyed myself playing ball and swimming in the rivers in the summertime, skating on the same frozen rivers in the wintertime. However, as a Jew, I was constantly reminded by the Gentiles in the town that I was not one of them, that I was a Jew. So we were always, otherwise, it wasn't terribly bad if you didn't think about the fact that you were constantly the Jew. It was the Jewish boy.
What year did you come to the United States?
We left Hungary in 1960. I lived in Vienna for close to a year, and we came to the United States in 61.
And you lived in Brooklyn, if I recall.
Yes, we settled in Borough Park, which was a very large concentration of Hungarian refugees from the 1956 revolution. And a large percentage of the Jews that lived in Brooklyn and Borough Park were very, very religious, Hasidic, very Orthodox. And I was enrolled in a yeshiva. My father was a Hungarian or a Pupa Chosid. And we lived very, very religiously, and we lived amongst some of the people that we met in Borough Park were friends of ours from Papa, who had emigrated in 1956 during the revolution. And when we came in 61, we met up with them and we became very friendly with them. My parents are actually buried next to some of our Papa friends that came to America, and they all bought cemetery plots in the same place.
I was one of those Hungarian refugees in 1956 who also lived in Brooklyn, a different section than Borough Park and Crown Heights, but we had friends in Crown Heights. And I was actually bar mitzvahed in Brooklyn by a Hungarian rabbi in 1961, February 27th of 1961. Let's jump a
Okay.
little ahead, Alex. Uh, you finished your schooling. You decided to become a doctor. When did you take up karate? Because we know you as a karate expert.
Well, chronologically, let me put it into a better order. I began to study karate when I was about 13 years old. I attended a karate class, and then later on, I switched and I joined a karate school in the Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville section of Brooklyn. It was an all black, what we called in those days ghetto, which today are called inner city communities. I was the only white kid in the karate school, and certainly the only Orthodox Jew. And I became very, very friendly with my friends that I made there. And to this day, many, many years later, we are in contact, and I have very wonderful relationships with some of the people. This was one of the best karate schools, probably in America. It was a very tough school. And I trained in the school. I became a black belt in 1968. And sometime later, I got married and I opened up karate school. And I opened up a couple of karate schools and I began to teach. In 1980, years later, I decided to go back to school and I began to study physiology. And ultimately, I enrolled in downstate, the State University of New York College of Medicine, and I began to study physiology and public health
Just
and
a second.
preventive.
This is 1980 when you were 30 years old.
Yes, I was teaching karate for many years. I got married. I had a son by that time, and I was very successful as a karate instructor. I had several schools. I was the coach of the U.S. national karate team. I competed and I coached in the world championships. So I was successful, but I wanted to study, and it was time for me to, put my mind to studying. And I went back to school and I began to study. There was a reason, a motivation for me. In 1980, we were talking about karate getting into the Olympics. I was the U.S. national coach, but I assumed once we get into the Olympics in '84, everybody's going to want to coach the Olympic team. So I figured if I start to study and study some physiology, I will have one thing nobody else will have, and I'll have an inside track to be the coach of the U.S. national karate team. So I began to study, and I ended up liking the area of medicine that I was studying. And of course, karate didn't get into the Olympics until last year, at which point I was no longer coaching and I was pretty much retired from actively participating in karate. So I kind of missed the boat on that. But I did spend 30 years at Downstate Medical Center. I was the director of the pediatric pulmonary laboratory where we were diagnosing children's lung disease and various other areas that affected the lungs.
Alex, thank you very much. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes. We must go for a commercial break. Don't go away, Alex.
I will stay here.
Thank you for coming back. We have Alex Sternberg with us, and we're going to continue our talk with him. We were talking about him being a big karate champion and a head of the U.S. national team at one point. We stopped that you went to medical school. You finished medical school.
I had that laboratory, and I did a lot of medical research and so on. Along the way, before all this happened, when I was in my teenage years, as a result of my background with my parents, who were Holocaust survivors, and I was a child of Holocaust survivors, an organization started in the New York area called the Jewish Defense League. The head of the organization was a Brooklyn-born rabbi, Rabbi Meir Kahana, and he heard that I was teaching karate in the Jewish community, and he got in touch with me and asked me if I was interested in getting involved and joining his group. I like the idea of Jews fighting back. I like the idea of Jews protecting themselves. And again, as a result of the fact that my parents were Holocaust survivors, and I wrote a book that talked about their years in Hungary, in the ghettos, and their time in Auschwitz, and so on. The idea of Jews fighting back resonated with me, so I got involved with the JDL, and I spent 4 years working with the Jewish Defense League, teaching Jewish kids how to protect themselves. And I set up karate classes and self-defense classes. And of course, Rabbi Kahana moved to Israel, and I got married, so we kind of not severed our relationship, but as life got involved, I got married, I had to start working for a living, I opened up karate schools, so my involvement with the Jewish Defense League ceased. And in 1972, I stopped being involved with them, but I did spend 4 very turbulent years demonstrating against the Soviet Union because they were holding Soviet Jews in prison, and they were discriminating against the Soviet Jews. So I was involved with a lot of those causes.
When I look at the book Recipes from Auschwitz, obviously it's not about Hungarian food or Polish food or Austrian pastries. What is the basic precept of this book that you wrote?
My mother was sent to Auschwitz in 1944. Her father went with her, but immediately upon arriving, there was the first selection. Her father was older.
He was gassed.
And he was gassed immediately. And my mother was
like my grandfather as well.
Yeah, my mother was in barrack B2C, which was the Hungarian section. And she spent many months there before she was shipped to another camp. And while she was there, her memories of Auschwitz, aside from the hunger and aside from the beatings and aside from the horrible conditions, was that while she was working with the other Hungarian ladies, they passed the time by talking recipes. So each lady would get up and say, well, I cook my Hungarian goulash this way, and I do the chicken soup that way. I make the cholent this way. So they began to start reciting the way they do the cooking. And my mother listened, and she had a wonderful memory. She memorized in school, she went to college in Hungary, and she memorized poetry in Latin and in Greek. And she could recite them 40 years after she studied them, and she had a good memory, so she remembered a lot of these recipes. When she came home from Auschwitz, she wrote them down, and she was cooking based on the recipes that she learned in Auschwitz. And as the years went by, my mother made me promise many times that I would write a book about her experiences and not to allow the next generation to forget, and certainly for me not to forget and for my family not to forget. So unfortunately, the book was published after she passed away. And basically, this was a book that is born out of a promise that I made to my mother. And the book itself talks about not just my mother and father, but through their experience, you get to have an idea of the Hungarian Jewish experience. 600,000 Jews were killed, about 100,000 were killed by the Hungarians. About another 450 to 500,000 were shipped by the Hungarians to Auschwitz, where the actual murder was done by the Germans, but had it not been for the Hungarian complicity, they would not have been able to ship so many in 7 weeks. Don't forget, Hungarian Jews
437,000 to be exact were shipped.
In 7 weeks. Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge, came into Hungary with 150 staff members. There was no way in a large country that he would have been able to round up all the Jews had it not been for the actual voluntary complicity. Interesting that when Eichmann was captured by the Israelis and put on trial in 1961, Eichmann testified that no matter how quickly they shipped the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, the Hungarians were never satisfied. And they kept complaining to Eichmann, it's not fast enough. There's still more left. It's not fast enough. So the Hungarians basically were very much complicit in the murder of 600,000 Jews. And this was something that, my parents carried with them for the rest of their life.
unfortunately, that's all very true. The Hungarians were very, very eager to get rid of the Jews.
Right.
And what other things that people don't know, that Hungary started in 1920 already the numerous clauses, keeping Jews out of universities.
The numerous clauses anti-Semitic law was the first such law in all of Europe, way before
That's
Hitler
correct.
came into existence. So
That's correct.
my mother was not allowed to study medicine, so she had to study pedagogy, or she became a teacher, because of that. So Hungary can brag that they had the first anti-Semitic law anywhere in Europe that they enacted without anybody prosecuting them or anybody telling them that they should do that. Today, Hungary is not denying the Holocaust, but they're sanitizing. They are saying that Hungary was the first country that was the first victim of the Nazis. They don't admit that they were complicit with the murder of 600,000 Jews. Basically, what they say was only the Germans. We saved the Jews. So the Hungarian narrative, they still don't want to admit what the Germans admitted. They admitted their sin. They admitted their fault.
I'd like to make a correction on that, and not to be a defender of Hungary or any other country for that matter. The Hungarian government, in fact, has admitted what they have done. And I might not agree with everything that's in the government of Hungary, just like I don't agree with everything that's in our government. But they have, since that time, recently have admitted the fact officially that they were complicit and that what they did on their own. That doesn't mean that Holocaust education gets down to every person today, and this is what we're doing as the Mensch Foundation in Hungary as well. Alex, it's wonderful to have you on, and I hope we can have you on again. This is a half an hour show, and the time is limited. It's good to see the book behind you, Recipes for Auschwitz, and I hope people will look at Amazon and buy your book. And it's important for us to remember the two words, never forget. Never forget.
I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. It was my pleasure to spend a little time discussing these things with you. You're very knowledgeable about the Holocaust and about the history of Hungary. So I am glad that you invited me, and I will be delighted to spend some more time with you whenever you think it's appropriate.
Thank you, Alex. Bye. As they say in French, shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Welcome back. The Mensch International Foundation, which I founded 20 years ago, is very much concerned about Holocaust education, and we spend a lot of time and money on it. So your donations are very valuable. Please give from your heart. We close the show now with the late Max Webb, Holocaust survivor, on Persian radio.
Where did you born in Poland? Which city?
Which city? I was raised in Lodz, city of Lodz.
Lodz.
Yeah.
Wow.
Second biggest city.
Second biggest city. در شهر لونچ دومین شهر بزرگ لهستان.
The Germans marched into the city of Lodz. They marched in August.
در آگوست 1939 در مارچ 1939 آلمان ها لهستان رو تسخیر کردند و وارد شهر زندگیشون شدند.
They started to put fires on all the Jewish synagogues. They burned down all the synagogues in the city of Lodz.
و بلافاصله تمام کنیسه‌های یهودیان شهر رو به آتش کشیدند.
I mean, it was a Hitler war. How actually to eliminate the Jewish people. So later I have seen, a few months later, where I used to live not far away, maybe 5 minutes away, was a big hospital, what was built before the war. And I noticed that a big truck comes along and backs up to this hospital. And I was curious to see what is a military truck going to do in this hospital. I found myself a spot for curiosity and to see what's going to be. I have seen they went into this hospital. They went in every room. Children have been born, most Jewish people, and they went into every room and took away the child, was a day, 2 days, or 5 days old, opened the windows, took the little children by the little legs, knocked them against the windows, and threw them down to the trucks. When I have seen this, I couldn't scream, I couldn't cry, my tears have been frozen. That's what I have seen.
میگه وقتی من این صحنه رو میدیدم میخواستم فریاد بزنم، نمیتونستم، میخواستم گریه کنم، نمیتونستم، اشکهام در چشمام گویی یخ زده بود. I'm so sorry. Awfully sorry that you remind you this tragedy. Yeah. After
it's a matter of fact, as I went the years through, about fighting survival, and through the fingers, a lot of things, Just one thing what will live with me as long as I am alive, what I have seen, how they took the children, little children, threw him down, from the hospital, killed him. This lives with me as long as I'm going to be alive.